How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. Imagine walking into a room full of strangers and within minutes turning them into friends, gaining their trust, and leaving a lasting impression. What if you had the power to influence people without manipulation, to make others genuinely enjoy your company, and to create meaningful relationships effortlessly? This isn't a far-fetched dream, it's the power of human connection, a skill that anyone can master with the right approach. First published in 1936, How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie has stood the test of time as one of the most influential self-help books in history. The book has sold millions of copies worldwide and has been translated into numerous languages, proving that its lessons on human interaction remain as relevant today as they were nearly a century ago. Drawing from real-life stories, psychological insights, and historical examples, Carnegie distills the fundamental principles of communication, leadership, and persuasion, skills that are crucial in both personal and professional life. At the time of its publication, the book was groundbreaking. The Great Depression had left many people struggling, not just financially but also socially and emotionally. Carnegie, a well-known public speaking coach and lecturer, recognized that success often hinges not on intelligence or technical expertise but on the ability to connect with people. His teachings were inspired by figures like Abraham Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, and even everyday individuals who mastered the art of human relations. Despite its widespread acclaim, the book has also sparked some debate. Critics argue that some of its principles, such as making people feel important or using a person's name often, might be seen as manipulative if applied insincerely. However, Carnegie emphasized genuine interest and authenticity as the core of his approach, making his advice more about self-improvement than deception. As Carnegie himself once said, "You can make more friends in 2 months by becoming genuinely interested in other people than you can in 2 years by trying to get other people interested in you." This summary is compiled and presented by Dadson Education, a not-for-profit organization dedicated to literary analysis and education. Our goal is to break down each chapter of this timeless book in an engaging, story-driven way, making the principles memorable and actionable. Whether you're looking to enhance your career, improve personal relationships, or simply become more confident in social settings, this guide will help you absorb Carnegie's lessons in a way that's easy to understand and apply. Now, let's dive into each chapter and uncover the secrets to winning friends, influencing people, and mastering the art of communication. Chapter 1. If you want to gather honey, don't kick over the beehive. James had always believed that tough love was the best way to manage his team. As the head of a small marketing firm, he prided himself on his high standards. Every Monday morning, he would march into the office, clipboard in hand, ready to point out every mistake his employees had made the previous week. "Why are these reports late again, Sarah?" he snapped at his assistant. "This design is completely off-brand, Mark." "Do it over," he said, tossing the project folder onto his designer's desk. "You guys need to step up your game," he muttered to no one in particular, shaking his head as he walked back to his office. At first, James thought his approach was motivating his employees. He assumed that by highlighting their flaws, he was pushing them to be better. But instead, something strange happened. Sarah, once an eager and energetic assistant, now avoided eye contact with him and did the bare minimum. Mark, a talented designer who used to come up with innovative ideas, stopped contributing in meetings. The rest of the team became quiet, afraid that anything they said or did would result in another round of criticism. One day, after yet another disappointing performance review, James sat in his office, frustrated. Why isn't anyone improving? He wondered. Why don't they care? The answer came unexpectedly. That weekend, James attended a leadership seminar, where the speaker posed a simple question. Think about the last time someone criticized you. Did it make you want to improve? Or did it make you defensive, angry, or discouraged? James sat back in his chair, stunned. He had always thought that correcting mistakes was the key to success, but he had never stopped to think about how it felt to be on the receiving end of constant criticism. Determined to change, James decided to try something new. Instead of focusing on what his employees were doing wrong, he began noticing and acknowledging what they did right. On Monday, he walked into the office and said, "Sarah, I noticed you handled that difficult client last week really well. Your patience was impressive. Sarah's face lit up. Later that day, he told Mark, that last campaign you worked on was really creative. I'd love to see more of your ideas in the next project. Mark smiled and nodded. Actually, I do have an idea I've been thinking about. Slowly, the office atmosphere changed. People began engaging, contributing, and feeling motivated again. James had learned a crucial lesson. Criticism rarely inspires change, but appreciation and encouragement do. Dale Carnegie opens his book with a powerful message: if you want to influence people, don't start with criticism. Many of us believe that pointing out others' mistakes will push them to do better. But in reality, criticism often triggers defensiveness, resentment, or discouragement. Instead of helping someone improve, it makes them feel attacked. Carnegie highlights a simple truth: people crave appreciation, not condemnation. Even in the face of mistakes, a few words of encouragement can go a long way in inspiring someone to do better. One of the most famous examples he shares is Abraham Lincoln, who, in his early political career, had a habit of publicly criticizing others. But after nearly provoking a duel, Lincoln realized that attacking people's faults only made enemies. He changed his approach and became known for his tact, diplomacy, and ability to inspire loyalty, qualities that eventually made him one of the greatest leaders in history. The lesson here is simple: instead of criticizing, try understanding. Look for opportunities to praise, even if the progress is small. When correction is necessary, do it gently, framing feedback in a way that encourages improvement rather than discouragement. As Carnegie famously puts it, any fool can criticize, condemn, and complain, but it takes character and self-control to be understanding and forgiving. The next time you're tempted to point out someone's mistake, pause. Try appreciation instead of criticism. You might be surprised by the results. Chapter 2: The Big Secret of Dealing with People. Emma had been working at her new job for just a few weeks when she realized that winning over her boss, Mr. Thornton, was going to be a challenge. He was known for being strict, rarely smiling, and never handing out compliments. The office whispered about how he never seemed satisfied with anyone's work, no matter how hard they tried. Determined to prove herself, Emma poured extra effort into her projects, double-checking every report and staying late to perfect her presentations. But no matter what she did, Mr. Thornton barely acknowledged her work beyond a curt nod or a quick fix this scribbled in red ink. It was frustrating. She wondered if she would ever get on his good side. One afternoon, as she walked past his office, she noticed him sitting alone, reviewing old project files. His usual stern expression had softened, and for a moment, he looked exhausted. A realization hit her: he wasn't just demanding, he was carrying the weight of the entire company on his shoulders. That evening, instead of leaving the office frustrated, Emma did something different. She walked up to his desk and said, "Mr. Thornton, I've been looking through the company's past reports, and I noticed something. The strategies you implemented 5 years ago really turned things around. The growth charts from then to now are incredible." Mr. Thornton looked up, surprised. He studied her face for a moment, as if trying to gauge whether she was being sarcastic. But Emma meant every word. She had seen the numbers, and his leadership had indeed made a difference. For the first time since she started working there, he smiled. "You really looked at the old reports?" he asked, his tone lighter than usual. "I did," she nodded. "I just think it's impressive how you've built the company into what it is today." From that moment on, things changed. Mr. Thornton became more open in his interactions with Emma. He started asking for her opinion during meetings, acknowledging her efforts, and even sharing bits of his experiences in the industry. The ice had melted not because she had tried harder to impress him, but because she had given him something every human being craves: appreciation. Dale Carnegie describes this as the big secret of dealing with people, making them feel valued. People don't just want money, promotions, or recognition. They want to know that their work, struggles, and efforts matter. Sincere appreciation has the power to change relationships instantly. Carnegie warns, however, that there is a difference between flattery and genuine appreciation. Flattery is empty, insincere, and often self-serving. People can sense when they are being manipulated. True appreciation, on the other hand, comes from an honest recognition of someone's contributions. It makes people feel seen and valued, which in turn inspires them to do their best. One of the greatest historical examples of this principle is Charles Schwab, one of the most successful business leaders of his time. Instead of criticizing his employees, he made it a habit to praise them whenever he noticed even small improvements. He once said, "I consider my ability to arouse enthusiasm among my people the greatest asset I possess." His genuine appreciation built loyalty and motivated his employees to work harder, not out of fear, but out of respect and a desire to excel. So how can this lesson be applied in daily life? Instead of waiting for a special occasion to recognize someone's efforts, find moments to sincerely appreciate people. A simple "I noticed how much effort you put into this," or "I really admire the way you handled that situation" can make a lasting impact. As Carnegie puts it, the deepest principle in human nature is the craving to be appreciated. In a world where people often feel overlooked or taken for granted, a few kind words of sincere appreciation can transform attitudes, build stronger relationships, and create an environment where people feel valued. The next time you interact with someone, take a moment to notice what they do well and tell them. It might just change everything. Chapter 3: He who can do this has the whole world with him. Jacob had been in sales for years, but nothing could have prepared him for Mr. Langley, a wealthy, no-nonsense businessman who had a reputation for dismissing salespeople within minutes. As Jacob stepped into Langley's grand office, he could already feel the tension in the air. The older man barely looked up from his desk, shuffling through paperwork as he muttered, "You've got 5 minutes." Most salespeople would panic at this cold reception. They would immediately launch into their pitch, trying to impress him with statistics, benefits, and promises. But Jacob had learned something valuable in his career: people don't care about what you're selling until they feel like you care about them. Instead of diving into his product presentation, Jacob glanced around the office. Among the towering stacks of papers and awards, one thing stood out: a framed photo of Mr. Langley shaking hands with a famous race car driver. "That's an incredible photo," Jacob said, pointing to the frame. "Are you a big racing fan?" For the first time, Mr. Langley looked up. His eyes softened slightly as he turned to the picture. "That was taken at the Monaco Grand Prix. I've been a racing fan since I was a kid." Jacob leaned forward with genuine curiosity. "No way. Have you ever driven a race car yourself?" And just like that, the dynamic shifted. Mr. Langley, who had moments ago been uninterested and distant, suddenly became animated. He leaned back in his chair and started reminiscing about the races he had attended, the thrill of speed, and his admiration for the sport's precision and skill. For the next 45 minutes, Jacob barely said a word. He simply listened, nodding at the right moments, asking follow-up questions, and showing sincere enthusiasm. By the time Mr. Langley finally stopped talking, he looked at Jacob with a smile, a rarity in his office. "You know," he said, "you're the first salesman who didn't try to shove a pitch down my throat. What is it you're selling again?" That day, Jacob walked out not only with a sale but with a client who would go on to be one of his most loyal customers. Dale Carnegie explains that the key to winning people over isn't about being the most charismatic, persuasive, or knowledgeable person in the room. It's about making others feel important. People don't want to be lectured or impressed, they want to be heard. When someone truly listens to them, they feel valued, and that creates an instant connection. Carnegie emphasizes that this must be done genuinely. Fake interest is easy to spot and will have the opposite effect. The best way to make people feel important is to truly be interested in them, their passions, their experiences, and their stories. One of the most powerful historical examples of this principle is President Theodore Roosevelt. Before meeting anyone, Roosevelt made it a habit to research their interests so he could discuss topics they cared about. He understood that people love to talk about themselves, and if you let them, they will walk away feeling not just heard, but deeply respected. This lesson is simple yet incredibly powerful. If you want to connect with people, focus on them. Ask questions. Listen with full attention. Show that you care. In a world where everyone is eager to be heard, being the one who listens is what sets you apart. As Carnegie puts it, the royal road to a person's heart is to talk about the things he or she treasures most. The next time you meet someone, whether it's a client, a colleague, or even a stranger, resist the urge to dominate the conversation. Instead, listen. Make them feel important. If you do, you won't just win the conversation, you'll win the person. Chapter 4. Do this and you'll be welcome anywhere. Ethan had always loved to travel, but this particular trip felt different. After months of planning, he finally arrived in a small village in Italy, eager to immerse himself in the culture. However, there was one problem: he didn't speak a word of Italian. On his first day, he walked through the bustling streets, marveling at the colorful markets and historic architecture. But as he tried to ask for directions or order food, he was met with blank stares, confused expressions, or polite but distant responses. The locals seemed warm with each other, yet he remained an outsider. Frustrated, Ethan sat at a cafe, watching as a group of elderly men laughed and chatted over espressos. What was he doing wrong? Then, he noticed something simple yet powerful. Every interaction between the locals started with a warm smile, a genuine, effortless expression of friendliness. Determined to change his approach, Ethan tried something different. The next morning, instead of nervously stumbling over broken Italian, he walked into a bakery, made eye contact with the shopkeeper, and smiled. Instantly, the older woman behind the counter brightened. Buongiorno, she greeted warmly, her previous indifference replaced with enthusiasm. She patiently helped him choose a pastry, chuckling at his attempts to pronounce the names, and even threw in an extra biscotti for a new friend. As Ethan continued his journey, he made it a habit to greet people with a smile before speaking. The transformation was remarkable. Vendors who had previously seemed distant now engaged with him. Locals who had ignored him before now nodded in recognition. By the end of his trip, Ethan felt less like a tourist and more like a welcomed guest. Dale Carnegie's lesson in this chapter is beautifully simple yet incredibly powerful. A genuine smile is the universal key to human connection. It requires no translation, no cultural adjustment, and no elaborate introduction. A warm smile signals friendliness, openness, and goodwill, making people naturally gravitate toward you. Carnegie emphasizes that this isn't about forcing a fake grin or using it as a manipulation tactic. A genuine smile, one that comes from a place of warmth and sincerity, has the power to break barriers, dissolve tension, and make others feel at ease. One of the greatest historical examples of this is President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was famous for his infectious smile. Even in times of crisis, his warmth reassured the American people, making him one of the most beloved leaders in history. So how can we apply this in our daily lives? The next time you meet someone, whether a stranger, a coworker, or a friend, start with a smile. Notice how it transforms interactions, how people respond more positively, and how doors that seemed closed suddenly open. As Carnegie puts it, the expression one wears on one's face is far more important than the clothes one wears on one's back. Ethan's experience in Italy taught him a lesson that applies everywhere. No matter where you are in the world, if you smile genuinely, you'll never be a stranger for long. Chapter 5. A simple way to make a good first impression. Maya had been searching for a new job for months, and this interview felt like her best shot. She had done her research, practiced her answers, and even picked out the perfect outfit. But as she walked into the sleek office of Harper & Company, she couldn't shake the nerves bubbling inside her. Sitting across from her was Mr. Donovan, a senior hiring manager with a reputation for being tough to impress. He adjusted his glasses and glanced at her resume. "So, Maya, tell me why you want to work here," he said, his voice formal and measured. Maya took a deep breath and smiled. "Well, Mr. Donovan, I've admired Harper & Company for years. I know you've built a team that values innovation, and I'd love to contribute to that." Mr. Donovan gave a small nod, but his expression remained neutral. As the conversation continued, Maya did something most job candidates wouldn't think twice about. She used his name naturally throughout the interview. "I really appreciate that perspective, Mr. Donovan. It's clear that Harper & Company has a strong vision. I was reading about your recent project, Mr. Donovan. The results were impressive." Each time she said his name, Mr. Donovan's posture relaxed slightly. By the time they were halfway through, he was nodding more, leaning forward, even cracking a small smile. At the end of the interview, he stood up, extended his hand, and said, "Maya, I've interviewed dozens of candidates this week, but I have to say, this was one of the most engaging conversations I've had." A few days later, Maya got the call. She had landed the job. Dale Carnegie's lesson in this chapter is simple but powerful. A person's name is the sweetest sound to their ears. People love hearing their own name because it makes them feel recognized and valued. When you use someone's name in conversation, whether it's a new acquaintance, a client, or an interviewer, you create an instant connection. It shows that you respect them as an individual, rather than seeing them as just another face in the crowd. Carnegie shares a famous example of this principle in action through Theodore Roosevelt, who had an extraordinary memory for names. He made a habit of remembering and using people's names, no matter their status. Whether he was speaking to a foreign diplomat or the White House staff, he made each person feel important simply by calling them by name. But Carnegie also warns, this must be done with sincerity. Using someone's name too frequently or in a forced way can feel unnatural. The key is to weave it into the conversation smoothly and genuinely. So how can we apply this lesson in daily life? When meeting someone new, make an effort to remember their name. Use it in conversation. "It was great meeting you, Sarah," or "That's an interesting point, David." When sending emails or messages, personalize them with the recipient's name instead of generic greetings. As Carnegie puts it, remember that a person's name is to that person the sweetest and most important sound in any language. Maya's job interview wasn't won just by her qualifications, it was won by her ability to make Mr. Donovan feel acknowledged and valued. And that's the kind of first impression that lasts. Chapter 6. If you want to be interesting, be interested. Daniel had never been comfortable at social gatherings. At parties, he often found himself lingering near the edges of the room, sipping his drink, and wondering how some people could effortlessly charm an entire crowd. Conversations always seemed to fizzle out quickly for him, and he dreaded the awkward silence that followed. One evening, Daniel found himself at a networking event for work. It was the kind of event he usually tried to avoid, loud, full of confident people exchanging stories, jokes, and business cards. He was about to call it an early night when he remembered something a mentor had once told him: "If you want to be interesting, don't try to impress people, just be interested in them." Determined to try something new, Daniel approached a group engaged in lively conversation. Instead of waiting for a chance to talk about himself, he simply asked the man next to him, "What do you do for fun outside of work?" The man's face lit up. "Oh, I'm really into photography," he said, suddenly animated. "I love capturing landscapes, especially during sunrise." Instead of nodding politely and moving on, Daniel leaned in. "That sounds incredible. What's the most stunning place you've ever photographed?" For the next 20 minutes, the photographer eagerly shared stories of chasing golden hour light and hiking to remote locations just to get the perfect shot. Daniel barely spoke, he just listened, asked questions, and showed genuine enthusiasm. Before long, others joined the conversation. A woman who had been standing nearby jumped in. "I love photography too. Have you ever tried film cameras?" By the end of the night, Daniel was surrounded by people, laughing, swapping stories, and making connections. The best part? He hadn't said much about himself at all. Instead, he had simply done what most people forget to do: he showed genuine curiosity about others. Dale Carnegie's key lesson in this chapter is that people love to talk about themselves, their interests, and their experiences. If you take the time to listen and ask questions, you become instantly likable. Instead of trying to impress people with your own stories, the secret to great conversation is to make others feel important by being interested in them. Carnegie shares the example of President Theodore Roosevelt, who was known for his ability to connect with anyone he met. Before speaking with a guest, Roosevelt would research their interests so he could discuss what mattered to them. Whether it was politics, sports, or literature, he made people feel valued by engaging in topics they were passionate about. However, Carnegie warns that this interest must be sincere. People can quickly detect when someone is feigning curiosity just to manipulate a conversation. The key is to genuinely care about what the other person is saying. Applying this in everyday life is simple but powerful. Instead of trying to be the most charismatic person in the room, Shift your focus outward. The next time you meet someone, ask open-ended questions like what excites you the most about what you do, or what's a hobby you could talk about for hours. Then, truly listen. As Carnegie puts it, you can make more friends in 2 months by becoming genuinely interested in other people than you can in 2 years by trying to get other people interested in you. Daniel's night at the networking event was a turning point. By the time he left, he had more connections than ever before, not because he had tried to stand out, but because he had taken the time to make others feel seen. Chapter 7: How to Win People to Your Way of Thinking. Mark had always been a firm but loving father, yet lately, his relationship with his teenage son, Ryan, felt like a battlefield. Every conversation turned into an argument, whether it was about grades, curfews, or the company Ryan kept. Mark's usual approach was to lay down the rules, expecting Ryan to follow them without question. But instead of obedience, he got resistance. One evening, after yet another heated argument, Mark sat alone in the living room, frustrated and exhausted. He couldn't understand why Ryan refused to listen. Then, he remembered something a mentor had once told him: if you want to change someone's mind, start by seeing things from their perspective. Determined to try a different approach, Mark knocked on Ryan's door the next day, not to lecture, but to listen. "Ryan," he said, "I feel like we're always fighting, and I don't want that. Can you help me understand what's really going on?" Ryan looked skeptical at first, but after a long pause, he sighed. "Dad, you never actually listen. You just tell me what to do. You don't get what it's like to be me." That hit Mark hard. For years, he had been so focused on making Ryan see things his way that he had never truly stopped to understand Ryan's world. So that night, instead of offering solutions or demanding respect, Mark did something different. He asked questions. "What's been the hardest part of school lately? What do you wish I understood about your life? What do you think I could do differently as your dad?" At first, Ryan gave short, cautious answers. But as Mark kept listening, without interrupting, without judging, the conversation deepened. Ryan talked about the pressure he felt, the expectations weighing on him, and the frustration of always being treated like a child. For the first time in a long time, father and son weren't arguing, they were connecting. Over the next few weeks, Mark noticed something incredible. The more he listened, the less Ryan pushed back. Conversations that once ended in slammed doors now ended with mutual understanding. Mark didn't have to demand respect anymore, he earned it by showing respect first. Dale Carnegie's lesson in this chapter is one of the most powerful in the book. The best way to influence people is to understand them first. Most of us instinctively try to convince others by pushing our own arguments harder, but real persuasion begins with listening. People are far more likely to be open to your perspective when they feel like you genuinely understand theirs. Carnegie gives the example of Abraham Lincoln, a leader who rarely criticized others and instead tried to see situations from their point of view. Lincoln knew that attacking someone's beliefs only makes them defensive. Instead of forcing his opinions, he built bridges by respecting and considering opposing viewpoints. The key takeaway: if you want to win someone over, don't argue, listen. Instead of trying to prove your point, start by asking, "Why do you feel that way? What's important to you about this? How can we find common ground?" As Carnegie puts it, "I consider my ability to arouse enthusiasm among my people the greatest asset I possess, and the way to develop the best in a person is by appreciation and encouragement." Mark's breakthrough with Ryan didn't come from lecturing or punishing, it came from understanding. And that's how you truly win people to your way of thinking. Chapter 8: You Can't Win an Argument. Jacob was a brilliant lawyer, sharp, articulate, and fiercely logical. In the courtroom, he thrived on debate, dismantling opposing arguments with precision. But outside of work, his need to always be right was costing him dearly. At dinner parties, he corrected people's facts. In meetings, he shot down colleagues' ideas with cold logic. Even in casual conversations, he couldn't resist proving someone wrong. He thought he was simply standing by the truth, but he failed to notice what was happening around him. People avoided conversations with him, clients started choosing other attorneys, and his relationships felt strained. One day, he met with a longtime client, Mrs. Reynolds, to discuss a contract dispute. As she explained her position, Jacob immediately spotted a flaw in her reasoning. Without hesitation, he interrupted. Legally speaking, that argument doesn't hold. The clause in question clearly states. Mrs. Reynolds held up a hand. Jacob, I know you're right. You always are. But I don't feel heard. She sighed. I came to you for guidance, not a lecture. That sentence stuck with Jacob. What was the point of winning every argument if it meant losing trust, respect, and relationships? Dale Carnegie's lesson in this chapter is clear. Winning an argument often means losing a relationship. No matter how logical or factual your argument is, making someone feel wrong doesn't make them change their mind, it just makes them defensive. Carnegie shares a powerful insight. You can't win an argument because even if you prove your point, you've likely hurt the other person's pride. And when pride is wounded, people rarely admit defeat. Instead, they dig in deeper, convinced more than ever that they were right all along. One of the greatest historical examples of avoiding unnecessary arguments comes from Benjamin Franklin. In his early years, Franklin was known for being sharp-tongued and quick to correct others. But as he matured, he realized that persuasion wasn't about proving others wrong, it was about guiding them toward the right conclusion on their own. He developed a habit of softening his approach with phrases like I may be wrong, or I understand your point, but have you considered, ensuring that he avoided direct confrontation while still influencing the discussion. Jacob began to rethink his approach. The next time he met with Mrs. Reynolds, he listened first, acknowledging her concerns before offering his legal opinion. Instead of debating her, he guided her toward the right decision without making her feel wrong. His reputation started to change. Clients trusted him more, colleagues sought his advice, and friends felt comfortable talking to him again. As Carnegie puts it, the only way to get the best of an argument is to avoid it. Jacob finally understood that being right wasn't nearly as important as being respected. Chapter 9: A Sure Way of Making Enemies and How to Avoid It. Mr. Thompson had been teaching high school for over a decade, but nothing frustrated him more than students who refused to take responsibility for their mistakes. One student, in particular, Jason, was especially stubborn. Whenever Mr. Thompson pointed out an error in Jason's work, the boy would argue back, shifting the blame to confusing instructions, the textbook, or even the teacher himself. One day, after Jason turned in yet another sloppy assignment, Mr. Thompson was ready to lay into him. But before speaking, he paused, remembering something he had read about human nature. People rarely accept criticism outright, but they are far more open when they see vulnerability in others. Instead of attacking Jason's mistakes, he decided to take a different approach. Holding up the paper, he sighed and said, "You know, Jason, when I was your age, I had a teacher who used to mark my essays full of red ink. I'd get so frustrated, convinced that my mistakes weren't really my fault. But looking back, I realize now that my teacher wasn't out to get me, he was trying to help me improve. And you know what? I wish I had listened sooner." Jason, who had been bracing for another reprimand, was caught off guard. Instead of launching into his usual defense, he hesitated. For the first time, Mr. Thompson wasn't just another authority figure telling him what he was doing wrong, he was someone who had once been in the same position, someone who understood. With the tension diffused, Mr. Thompson continued. "I'm telling you this because I see a lot of potential in you. But this assignment, I know you can do better. What do you think we can do to make it stronger?" For the first time, Jason didn't argue. He nodded, took back the paper, and agreed to make revisions. Dale Carnegie's lesson in this chapter is simple but powerful. If you want people to be open to correction, start by admitting your own faults first. When you approach someone with humility instead of criticism, their natural defensiveness fades, making them more receptive to your message. Carnegie shares the example of Benjamin Franklin, who learned early in life that correcting people bluntly only made them resentful. Instead, Franklin adopted a softer approach, prefacing his opinions with phrases like, "I could be wrong, or perhaps I'm mistaken, but it seems to me." By first acknowledging his own fallibility, he made others more willing to consider his perspective. Most people instinctively resist being told they are wrong. But when they see that you are willing to admit your own shortcomings, they become less focused on defending themselves and more open to self-reflection. This principle can be applied in everyday life. whether in personal relationships, the workplace, or even casual conversations. If you want to correct someone, don't start with blame, start with understanding. A parent can soften a lecture by saying, "I remember making the same mistake when I was your age." A manager can earn trust by admitting, "I could have communicated this better." As Carnegie puts it, admitting one's own mistakes even when one hasn't corrected them can help convince somebody to change his behavior. For Mr. Thompson, a small shift in approach changed everything. Jason, once the most resistant student in class, started taking feedback more seriously. And all it took was a simple act of humility. Chapter 10: The Secret of Socrates. Alex was a skilled negotiator, but lately, he had been struggling to close deals. He often found himself in tense standoffs with clients, where discussions turned into debates and agreements seemed impossible. The more he pushed, the more resistance he encountered. One day, during a particularly frustrating negotiation, Alex met with a potential client, Mr. Reynolds, who was skeptical about switching suppliers. As soon as Alex began his pitch, Mr. Reynolds crossed his arms. "I don't think your company can offer me anything better than what I already have," he said bluntly. Alex had been trained to counter objections with facts and figures, but something in Mr. Reynolds' tone told him that arguing wouldn't work. Instead of trying to prove the client wrong, Alex tried something different. He took a deep breath and asked, "Would you agree that efficiency is one of the most important factors in your business?" Mr. Reynolds nodded. "Of course. And would you say that even small improvements in efficiency could make a big difference in your overall costs?" Another nod. "Yes, that's true." Alex smiled. "Then if I could show you a way to improve efficiency without increasing your costs, wouldn't that at least be worth considering?" This time, Mr. Reynolds hesitated before answering. "Well, yes." Alex had him. Dale Carnegie called this technique the Socratic method, named after the ancient Greek philosopher Socrates, who would lead his students to the right conclusions by asking a series of questions that naturally guided their thinking. Carnegie's version of this strategy is simple: if you want someone to agree with you on a big idea, don't start with an argument. Instead, begin with small, undeniable statements that they are likely to agree with. People don't like to feel forced into changing their minds, but when they say yes multiple times in a conversation, their resistance starts to fade. Each small agreement creates momentum, making it much harder for them to turn around and say no to the final proposal. Carnegie gives real-world examples of how this method works in sales, leadership, and even personal relationships. A husband trying to convince his wife to take a vacation might start by saying, "Wouldn't it be nice to have a break from work?" Then, "Don't you think we've been under a lot of stress lately?" By the time he suggests a weekend getaway, she's already in agreement with the idea. This strategy isn't about manipulation, it's about guiding people toward solutions they might not have considered on their own. Arguments put people on the defensive, but a carefully structured series of yes questions makes them feel like they are reaching the decision themselves. As Carnegie puts it, the gentle art of getting the other person to say yes at the outset is the key to opening closed minds. By the end of the meeting, Mr. Reynolds was no longer resistant. He had agreed, step by step, that efficiency mattered, that improvements could help his business, and that Alex's proposal was worth considering. What started as a tense negotiation ended with a handshake and a signed contract. Alex had learned a valuable lesson that day. He didn't need to argue, pressure, or convince. He just needed to ask the right questions. Chapter 11: The Safety Valve in Handling Complaints. Sarah had been working in customer service for years, but nothing could have prepared her for the furious voice on the other end of the line. "This is unacceptable," the caller yelled. "I've been a loyal customer for years, and this is how you treat me. I want a refund immediately." Sarah glanced at the customer's account. The issue was a minor billing error, something that could be fixed in minutes. Her instinct was to jump in and explain the solution right away. But she had learned from experience that people in the heat of anger don't want solutions first, they want to be heard. Instead of interrupting, she took a deep breath and let the customer continue. He ranted about how much time he had wasted, how frustrated he felt, and how he was considering switching to a competitor. Sarah listened intently, occasionally offering small acknowledgements. "I understand, that must have been frustrating. and I'd feel the same way in your position." Slowly, the caller's voice softened. The more he spoke, the less angry he seemed. Finally, after several minutes of venting, he let out a sigh. "I just don't get why this happened," he said, his tone now calmer. Sarah knew this was her moment. "I really appreciate you sharing all of this with me," she said. "I completely understand why you're upset, and I want to make sure we make this right. Here's what I can do." Now that the customer had released his frustration, he was finally ready to listen. Sarah explained the issue, assured him it would be fixed, and even offered a small discount as a goodwill gesture. By the time the call ended, the once angry customer was thanking her for her help. Dale Carnegie's lesson in this chapter is simple but powerful. When people are upset, they don't want immediate solutions, they want someone to listen. Just like a steam valve releases pressure before an explosion, letting people vent their emotions first prevents conflicts from escalating. Carnegie tells a similar story about an executive who handled complaints with remarkable patience. Instead of arguing or defending his company, he simply listened, letting the customer say everything they needed to say. By the time he finally spoke, the customer had calmed down so much that they were open to a reasonable solution. This approach works not just in business, but in personal relationships as well. When a friend, partner, or colleague is upset, the worst thing you can do is dismiss their feelings or rush to fix the problem. Instead, give them space to vent. Once they feel heard, they'll be far more willing to work toward a solution. As Carnegie puts it, let the other person talk themselves out. They know more about their business and problems than you do. So ask them questions. Let them tell you a few things. Sarah had learned that lesson well. By simply listening first, she didn't just resolve a complaint, she turned an angry customer into a loyal fan. Chapter 12, If You Must Find Fault, This is the Way to Begin. Mark was a manager known for his high standards, and while his team respected his expertise, they dreaded his feedback sessions. Whenever he pointed out mistakes, employees left feeling discouraged rather than motivated. He didn't intend to demoralize them, he just wanted things done right. But over time, he noticed that morale was slipping, and performance wasn't improving the way he expected. One day, Mark needed to address a major issue with one of his employees, Lisa, whose recent reports had been full of errors. He knew he had to say something, but this time, he decided to take a different approach. As Lisa sat across from him, looking tense, Mark smiled and said, "Lisa, before we talk about anything else, I just want to say how much I appreciate your attention to detail. I've seen the way you handle client data, and your ability to organize information is one of the reasons we trust you with these reports." Lisa blinked in surprise. She had expected immediate criticism. Instead, Mark had started with something positive. He continued, "That's why I wanted to chat with you today. I noticed a few errors in the last reports, and I know that's not like you. I'm confident that if we take a closer look together, we can fix this quickly." Lisa, who normally felt defensive when receiving feedback, suddenly found herself open to the conversation. Instead of feeling attacked, she felt valued. By the end of the meeting, she was eager to correct the mistakes and even thanked Mark for his input. Dale Carnegie's lesson in this chapter is simple yet profoundly effective. If you must correct someone, always begin with praise. People respond far better to constructive criticism when they first feel recognized for their strengths. Carnegie highlights how even great leaders and educators use this technique. A school principal, for example, might start by telling a teacher, "You've done a fantastic job creating an engaging classroom environment," before gently addressing areas for improvement. A coach might first acknowledge an athlete's dedication before pointing out a flaw in their technique. This strategy works because it softens the natural resistance to criticism. When someone hears praise first, they feel valued rather than attacked. Their defenses lower, making them more receptive to feedback. Carnegie emphasizes that this isn't about flattery, it's about genuinely recognizing a person's strengths before addressing their weaknesses. When feedback is delivered this way, it becomes an opportunity for growth rather than a personal attack. As Carnegie puts it, beginning with praise is like the dentist who begins his work with Novocaine. The patient still gets a drilling, but the Novocaine kills the pain. Mark's small shift in approach transformed the way his team responded to feedback. Instead of dreading his meetings, employees began seeing them as opportunities to improve. Performance increased, morale improved, and Mark realized that sometimes, the best way to correct someone is to start by reminding them of what they're already doing right. Chapter 13: How to Spur People On to Success. Jake had always loved basketball, but no matter how hard he practiced, he never seemed to make much progress. His coach, Coach Miller, was tough but fair, and Jake often felt like he was falling short of expectations. Every missed shot, every slow sprint, and every fumbled pass weighed on him. He had started to believe that maybe he just wasn't good enough. One afternoon after practice, as Jake lingered behind in the gym, Coach Miller approached him. "Jake," he said, "I saw you out there today. You were moving faster on defense, and you made 3 solid passes that led to points. That's real improvement." Jake blinked. He hadn't expected praise, especially not after missing so many shots. "But I missed 5 layups," he muttered. Coach Miller nodded. "Yeah, you did. But last week, you missed 7. And the week before that, 10. You're getting better, and that's what matters." For the first time in weeks, Jake felt a surge of confidence. Maybe he wasn't failing, maybe he was improving. The next day at practice, he pushed himself harder than ever. He still made mistakes, but every time he improved, Coach Miller pointed it out. Within a month, Jake's performance had skyrocketed, and he had earned himself a spot in the starting lineup. Dale Carnegie's lesson in this chapter is clear: if you want to inspire people to succeed, praise their progress no matter how small. People thrive on encouragement, and nothing motivates them more than knowing they are improving. Carnegie shares stories of famous leaders and coaches who understood this principle well. The best mentors don't just focus on what needs fixing, they acknowledge what's already getting better. A music teacher might say, "Your timing has improved a lot since last week," instead of pointing out every wrong note. A manager might tell an employee, "Your reports are getting more detailed," instead of only mentioning the mistakes. This method works because people crave validation. When they feel like their efforts are noticed, they are more likely to keep improving. Carnegie warns against empty flattery. Praise must be sincere and specific to be effective. It's not about handing out false compliments, it's about recognizing real growth, even if it's just a small step forward. As Carnegie puts it, abilities wither under criticism, they blossom under encouragement. Coach Miller's simple act of encouragement changed everything for Jake. It wasn't just about basketball, it was about believing in himself. And sometimes, that's all someone needs to succeed. Chapter 14: Give a Dog a Good Name. For years, Danny had been labeled as the troublemaker of the class. Teachers sighed when they saw his name on their roster, and his classmates expected him to be the one sent to the principal's office. He had heard it all: lazy, disruptive, a problem. Eventually, he started living up to those labels. If people already saw him as trouble, why bother proving them wrong? Then, one day, everything changed. Danny's new teacher, Mrs. Carter, had read his file. She saw the notes about his behavior, the warnings from other teachers, and the low expectations attached to his name. But when she addressed the class on the first day, she introduced Danny differently. "This is Danny," she said with a warm smile. "I've heard he's one of the most creative thinkers in this school. I'm excited to see his leadership in action this year." Danny's head shot up. Leadership? Creativity? No one had ever described him that way before. At first, he assumed it was a mistake. But Mrs. Carter continued treating him like a leader, asking for his opinion in discussions, giving him small responsibilities, and praising him when he helped others. Slowly, something shifted in Danny. He started raising his hand more, putting effort into his assignments, and, without even realizing it, stepping into the leadership role Mrs. Carter had given him. By the end of the year, he wasn't just avoiding trouble, he was setting an example for his classmates. Dale Carnegie's lesson in this chapter is simple but powerful. People tend to live up to the labels they are given. If you want someone to behave better, treat them as if they already possess the qualities you want to see. Carnegie shares stories of managers who turned struggling employees into top performers simply by changing the way they spoke about them. Instead of saying, "John is always late and disorganized," a boss might say, "John has the potential to be one of our most dependable team members." When people hear themselves described in a positive light, they subconsciously start acting in ways that align with that image. This technique isn't about deception, it's about seeing the potential in people and encouraging them to reach it. A parent calling their child responsible rather than messy might inspire them to clean their room. A coach telling a player, "You have a great work ethic," can push them to train harder. As Carnegie puts it, if you want to improve a person in a certain respect, act as though that particular trait were already one of his outstanding characteristics. Mrs. Carter saw something in Danny before he saw it in himself. And because she treated him like a leader, he became one. Sometimes, all it takes to change someone's life is giving them a name worth living up to. Conclusion. Dale Carnegie's principles aren't just techniques for making friends or winning people over, they are the foundation for building real, meaningful relationships. Whether it's through genuine appreciation, listening with intent, or encouraging others to reach their potential, his lessons remind us that human connection is built on respect, kindness, and understanding. These ideas are as relevant today as they were when the book was first published. In a world where communication is often rushed or superficial, taking the time to truly connect with others can set us apart. Carnegie's insights show us that small changes like using someone's name, giving sincere praise, or letting others express themselves without interruption can have a profound impact. If we apply even a few of these principles, we won't just improve our personal and professional relationships, we might even change our own lives in the process. Relationships become stronger, conflicts become easier to resolve, and opportunities open up in ways we never expected. So why not start today? Smile at a stranger. Remember someone's name and use it. Listen to a friend without thinking of how you'll respond next. See what happens when you put these principles into practice. You might just be surprised by how much people respond and how much your world begins to change. This content is presented by Dadson Education, a non-profit organization dedicated to fostering inspiration and empowerment through meaningful literary discussions. If you found this message valuable, stay connected for more insightful and motivational content. Share it with others who might benefit, and join the conversation by sharing your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you.